A mother convinced a guy to leave her dark-skinned daughter for her light-skinned sister. But years later, at a fancy party, they were shocked to see who her husband had become. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments what city you're from. Nora had long since learned how to disappear in a room full of people who shared her blood. It wasn't about shrinking or folding herself inward, though as a child she had tried that too, quiet at the dinner table, head bowed at school functions, hands folded neatly in her lap during family gatherings. It was more subtle than that. It was the art of making herself invisible without moving a muscle, of letting her presence fade into the background while the brightness of others, lighter, louder, more palatable, filled the space. In the Davis household, it was impossible to forget who belonged and who did not. Her mother, Vivian Davis, possessed a kind of beauty that aged like expensive wine. Light complexion, sharp cheekbones, a posture honed by years of ballet lessons and social climbing. Her younger sister, Leah, inherited the same. The two of them walked through the world like a mirrored reflection of everything society adored. Soft curls easily tamed, delicate features, light skin kissed just enough by the sun to seem exotic, never inconvenient. And then there was Nora. Darker, taller, her features inherited not from her mother's side, but from the father who left before she could remember the sound of his voice. Her skin bore the color of coffee brewed strong, her hair a mass of tight curls that defied every attempt her mother made to straighten them into submission. From the moment she was old enough to notice the way people's eyes lingered on the three of them together, two perfect, light-skinned women and the odd, dark girl beside them, she understood that she was the exception, the flaw in their carefully curated picture. Vivian never let her forget it. At family dinners, her mother's attention slipped past her like she was made of air, pausing only to correct Nora's posture or question her choices with polite, clinical disapproval. "Leah will be graduating top of her class next year," Vivian would say to the neighbors, beaming. Such a driven, capable young woman. If Nora happened to be standing next to them, she'd add, almost as an afterthought, "And this is Nora. She's creative." Creative. As if that explained everything Nora lacked. Leah was everything Vivian had hoped to mold in a daughter. Straight A's, a future in law school, polished manners, the kind of beauty that opened doors before she even asked. Vivian praised her constantly, showered her with affection and approval that Nora only glimpsed in passing. It wasn't that Leah was cruel. If anything, she seemed vaguely uncomfortable with the pedestal she'd been placed on, but never enough to step down from it. For Nora, the hierarchy was clear. She was the disappointment, the rebellious one, the daughter who never quite fit. But, despite it all, there were places where Nora shined, quiet corners of her world her mother never noticed. Late nights spent sketching, her fingers stained with graphite and charcoal. Saturdays wandering through flea markets, buying scraps of fabric to sew clothes no one would wear but her. In her art, she found the freedom to be herself without apology. And then she met Oliver. It happened at a friend's birthday party, an event she almost skipped because she knew how evenings like that played out. The tight cliques, the curious glances, the small talk that made her want to crawl out of her skin. But something made her stay, and there he was. Tall, soft-spoken, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that didn't flicker when she spoke. He listened. He laughed at her dry humor, didn't flinch when she ranted about her family or confessed her doubts about her future. For 3 years, they built something steady. Simple dates, long walks, whispered conversations that felt like a secret only the two of them shared. He saw her, not as a shadow of her sister or a daughter who failed to meet expectations, but as herself. And for the first time, Nora felt like she could stop fading into the background. It wasn't perfect. Vivian's disapproval hovered over their relationship like a low, steady hum. "You're wasting your time with him," her mother had said once, folding napkins at the kitchen counter. "Men like that don't build futures with girls like you." She never explained what she meant by girls like you, but Nora understood all the same. Oliver ignored it, or at least she thought he did, until the small, unsettling changes began. It started with little things. Her mother's comments about how stable Leah's life was compared to Nora's artistic whims. Jokes about how Oliver deserved a partner who could match him. At first, Nora brushed them off, used to the casual cruelty woven into her mother's words. But then she noticed how often Vivian found reasons to invite Oliver over when Leah was home. How Leah began to linger in conversations, smiling too brightly, laughing too easily at his jokes. Nora told herself she was imagining it, until the night she wasn't. It was at one of their family dinners, the kind that felt more like a performance than a gathering. Vivian had pulled Oliver aside to help with something in the kitchen, her voice low and sweet, and Nora's stomach tightened in a way she couldn't explain. Minutes stretched into long absences. When she finally slipped past the dining room to find them, she heard her mother's voice through the half-closed door, calm and precise. "Leah is the one who can give you the life you deserve," Vivian said, as if she were discussing a real estate transaction, not her daughter's heart. "She's reliable. She has ambition. She knows her place." There was a pause, and then Oliver's voice, quiet, almost uncertain. "But I'm with Nora." And then the words that hollowed her out like a blade between the ribs. "For now." Nora stood frozen, her fingers curled into fists against the doorframe. She didn't remember walking back to the table, didn't remember smiling through the rest of the evening while her insides unraveled. That night, lying awake in her childhood bedroom, she stared at the ceiling and realized something she'd always known but never wanted to admit. Her mother would never love her the way she loved Leah. And now, she wasn't sure if Oliver ever had. It was the beginning of the end. The weeks that followed that dinner unfolded like a slow, suffocating dream from which Nora could not wake. Everything on the surface remained the same. Family dinners continued, Vivian arranged flowers meticulously in her pristine kitchen, Leah smiled politely across the table, and Oliver held her hand as if nothing had shifted beneath their feet. But Nora knew. She had heard the words, soft and poisonous, spoken behind a half-closed door. They clung to her skin like a damp chill, following her everywhere, into her sleep and through her days, until every glance, every gesture seemed like part of a script written without her consent. She wanted to confront them. She wanted to shout, to demand explanations, to force them to speak the truth aloud. But something stopped her. Pride, perhaps, or fear of hearing her worst suspicions confirmed. Instead, she watched and waited, gathering pieces of evidence like a detective in her own life. At first, the signs were subtle. Oliver grew quieter, more distracted. He canceled dinner plans with increasing frequency, always apologizing, always blaming work. When they were together, his mind seemed elsewhere, his smiles forced. He stopped asking about her sketches, no longer complimented her designs or teased her about the scraps of fabric strewn across her bedroom. When she mentioned future plans, moving in together, perhaps finding a place of their own, He nodded absently, changing the subject. Nora told herself it was stress. He was busy. She was imagining things. She had grown up under constant scrutiny, always questioning her own worth, always told she was too sensitive, too emotional. It was easy to convince herself that she was being paranoid, until she found the messages. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening. Oliver had left his phone on the coffee table when he went to the bathroom, and it buzzed once, then again. Nora wasn't the kind of person who invaded privacy. She had never checked his phone before, never needed to, but that night, something inside her urged her to look. The text was from Leah. "Dinner tomorrow? Mom suggested that new place downtown. Can't wait to catch up." Nora's stomach twisted. She scrolled back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The conversation stretched back weeks, friendly at first, then more intimate. Discussions about work, shared jokes, comments about how nice it was to have someone who understood. Nothing overtly inappropriate, but enough to make her skin crawl. Plans for lunches she hadn't known about. References to conversations they'd had without her. When she confronted Oliver, he brushed it off, his expression equal parts exasperation and confusion. "It's not what you think," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Your mom and Leah, they've just been including me, being friendly." "Behind my back?" she asked quietly. He sighed as if she were being unreasonable. "We're family, Nora. It would be weird if I didn't get along with them." That night, she lay awake long after Oliver left, staring at the ceiling, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She wasn't sure which hurt more, the texts or the way he had looked at her, like she was the one making something out of nothing. The cracks widened after that. Vivian's comments became bolder, almost careless, as if she no longer bothered to hide her disapproval. At a family brunch, she praised Leah's recent promotion at her law firm, turning to Oliver with a knowing smile. "Isn't it wonderful to have someone so driven in the family?" she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Nora before moving away. Leah, for her part, remained maddeningly polite. She complimented Nora's outfits, asked after her work, offered empty smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Nora wanted to believe her sister wasn't complicit, that she wasn't part of whatever unspoken conspiracy was unraveling her life, but the messages told another story. Leah had been watching, waiting. Jamie noticed before Nora would admit it to herself. They were having coffee at their usual spot, a small cafe tucked away from the bustle of downtown, when Jamie leaned across the table and said quietly, "He doesn't look at you the same way anymore." Nora stirred her drink, keeping her gaze fixed on the swirl of cream and coffee. "We're just going through a rough patch." Jamie didn't argue. She never did. She simply reached out and squeezed Nora's hand, her silence heavier than any words. 3 months after that dinner, the truth became undeniable. It was a rainy Saturday, the sky heavy with clouds, the kind of day that made the city feel gray and tired. Nora had spent the morning wandering aimlessly, her thoughts tangled, her chest tight. She carried concert tickets in her bag, a surprise for Oliver, for a band he loved, a small attempt to fix whatever was broken between them. She let herself into his apartment with the key he had given her months ago, back when they had talked about finding a place together. The apartment was quiet, the air still. She almost called out, but something stopped her. A trail of clothing led down the hallway. Her breath caught. She followed the trail, each step heavy, her heart pounding louder with every discarded piece of fabric. A jacket she didn't recognize, a blouse she knew too well, Leah's crumpled on the floor. The bedroom door was ajar. She pushed it open. Time stopped. Leah's dark hair spilled across Oliver's chest as they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies pressed together in intimate familiarity. They didn't notice her at first, lost in each other, the sound of their laughter sharp and cruel in the silence. The concert tickets slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like fallen leaves. Oliver looked up first, his expression shifting from contentment to shock. He scrambled to sit up, dragging the blanket over himself, his mouth opening to speak. Leah simply stared, her face unreadable, more annoyed than ashamed. "This isn't," Oliver began. "Don't," Nora said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Leah sat up slowly, making no effort to cover herself. "You were going to find out eventually." Nora's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "How long?" Oliver couldn't meet her eyes. 2 months, officially. Her gaze flicked to Leah. "Since Mom had her little chat with you?" The flicker of surprise on their faces confirmed everything she needed to know. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She turned and walked away. The storm came later, alone in her apartment, her chest hollowed out, her body shaking with rage and grief, and the crushing weight of betrayal. The next morning, she confronted her mother. Vivian was arranging flowers in the kitchen, as if nothing had happened, as if her carefully constructed world hadn't just imploded. "You knew," Nora said quietly. Her mother glanced up, her expression composed, almost bored. "Don't be so dramatic, Nora. Relationships end all the time." Nora's throat tightened. "You did this." Vivian sighed, setting the flowers aside. "Leah and Oliver make sense together. You must see that." "Why?" The word tore from her, raw and desperate. "Why would you do this to me?" Her mother's gaze softened fractionally, but it wasn't kindness, just pity. "Because Leah has always worked harder. She knows what she wants. You're a dreamer, Nora. You'll find someone better suited to your temperament." It wasn't anger that filled her then. It wasn't even heartbreak. It was something colder, heavier, a final, irrevocable understanding. Her mother would never choose her. She spent that night packing everything she could fit into her car. She didn't tell Oliver or Leah. She left no dramatic farewell, no confrontation. Just a note. 3 words scrawled hastily on the kitchen counter. "Watch me thrive." She texted Jamie at midnight, asking if she could crash on her couch. The next morning, with everything she owned crammed into the back seat of her car, she drove away from the city she had once called home, leaving behind the family who had never truly seen her. Ahead of her stretched the highway, endless and open, the sky beginning to lighten at the edges. Nora didn't look back. The city greeted her with rain. Not the soft, tentative drizzle of spring, but the relentless, driving downpour that seemed determined to strip away everything soft and fragile from the streets. Nora's windshield wipers struggled against the sheets of water, blurring the unfamiliar landscape outside as she navigated her way into New York like a refugee seeking shelter. Her car crammed with everything she hadn't been willing to leave behind. It had been a long drive, but Nora barely noticed the miles. The rhythm of the tires on wet asphalt had become background noise to the thoughts ricocheting through her head. Fragments of conversations, the weight of betrayal, her mother's cold smile, Leah's indifferent stare. They hovered like ghosts in the periphery, but she refused to let them consume her. The GPS directed her to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, a place that smelled faintly of cigarettes and damp carpet, where the fluorescent lights flickered overhead and the clerk barely looked up when she checked in. The room was small, the bed sagging in the middle, but it was hers. A place where no one knew her name, where no one would look at her and see a disappointment. She allowed herself 5 minutes to cry. No more. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she buried her face in her hands and let the grief wash over her, not just for Oliver or Leah or her mother, but for the years she had spent trying to fit herself into a family that never made space for her. For the version of herself she had tried to become to earn their love. For the quiet, persistent hope that had died the moment she'd pushed open that bedroom door. When the alarm on her phone chimed, she wiped her face, stood up, and began to plan. The next 3 days passed in a haze of logistics and exhaustion. Nora spent her mornings scrolling through apartment listings, her afternoons filling out job applications, her evenings driving through unfamiliar streets to view places she couldn't afford. Her savings were meager, just enough to last 2 months if she was careful, maybe 3 if she skipped meals. The apartments she toured were small, cramped, often barely livable. But on the 3rd day, she found one that felt different. It was a studio in Uptown, old and a little rough around the edges, with peeling paint on the walls and an elevator that worked half the time. But it had large windows that let in soft, diffused light, and when she stood in the middle of the empty room, she felt something shift inside her, a spark of possibility. She signed the lease that afternoon, handing over most of her savings without hesitation. She told herself it wasn't recklessness, but commitment. She wasn't running anymore. She was building. Her new home came furnished with second-hand pieces left by the previous tenant. A battered futon, a chipped table, a mismatched set of dishes. She unpacked her belongings slowly, arranging them with deliberate care, turning the space into something resembling a life. Her sketchbooks and pencils occupied one corner of the table. A stack of job applications sat neatly beside them. It was a beginning, but beginnings were harder than she remembered. The job hunt stretched longer than she expected. Rejections piled up in her inbox, sometimes polite, sometimes indifferent, often impersonal. No one wanted to hire an art graduate with no corporate experience and no connections. She worked odd shifts at a diner for minimum wage, barely covering rent. Nights were spent sketching, the lines on the page growing sharper, angrier, more determined. She counted every dollar, every hour, rationing food, skipping meals to stretch her savings. But even that wasn't enough. By the end of the month, she was desperate. The interview at Meridian Investment Group was supposed to be her last shot, a position she wasn't remotely qualified for, an administrative role that promised a steady paycheck and benefits she hadn't dared dream about in years. She wore her best dress, a simple navy number she'd bought on clearance years ago, and pressed it carefully the night before. Her shoes were scuffed but clean. She braided her hair tightly, pinning it neatly at the back of her head, trying to look like the version of herself she thought they wanted. The receptionist at Meridian barely glanced at her as she arrived, directing her to a waiting area where another candidate sat, polished and poised in an expensive suit. Nora felt the weight of her thrift store dress, the tiredness etched into her face after weeks of stress and sleepless nights. When a woman with a sleek bob and sharp glasses appeared, Nora braced herself for another rejection. "I'm Carol from HR," the woman said briskly. "There's been a change. The position you applied for has been filled internally." Nora's stomach dropped. "I want to show you something," he said without preamble. Nora accepted the folder, her brows knitting together as she flipped through the pages inside. It wasn't a client profile or a market report. It was a business plan, detailed, meticulously organized, outlining the framework for a boutique investment firm focused on sustainable businesses and first-generation entrepreneurs. "This is yours?" she asked, glancing up at him. Patrick nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's something I've been developing for a while." "It's ambitious," she said carefully, closing the folder. "Why show me?" "Because I'm leaving Meridian next month to launch it," he replied, his voice calm but edged with something like hope, "and I want you to come with me." Nora blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Me?" "Not as an assistant," he clarified, "as operations manager. You've been running half of this office without anyone noticing. I don't want someone with the right degree. I want someone who understands how to build things from the ground up." The weight of the offer settled over her like a blanket. Heavy, warm, terrifying. "That's insane," she said, her pulse quickening. "I barely understand the world you live in." "You understand more than you think," he countered. She didn't answer him that night, nor the next. She turned the idea over in her mind like a fragile object testing its edges. The risk terrified her, but so did the idea of staying where she was, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, working in the shadow of someone else's vision. When she finally said yes, it felt like stepping off a ledge and learning how to fly on the way down. The transition from employee to business partner happened quietly, without the fanfare or drama she might have once expected. They rented a small office downtown, cheap and unremarkable, with cracked linoleum floors and flickering lights. Their desks were mismatched. The conference table was an old dining table rescued from a second-hand store. They worked from morning until long past midnight, building systems, crafting proposals, pitching to clients who barely gave them the time of day. Their first clients were small businesses, cafes struggling to stay afloat, local manufacturers trying to expand, immigrant entrepreneurs who couldn't secure funding from traditional banks. They weren't glamorous accounts, but they mattered. Nora spent her days balancing budgets, refining contracts, organizing teams. Her nights were filled with sketches, not of fashion, but of business structures and operational flowcharts. The work was exhausting, but it was theirs. The lines between professional and personal blurred without either of them noticing at first. Late nights became dinners shared over spreadsheets, conversations that drifted from business strategies to childhood memories. Patrick spoke of his father's construction company, the expectations he had walked away from. Nora offered fragments of her own past, never the full story, but enough to hint at the shadows that lingered behind her careful facade. One night, long after the city had gone quiet outside their office windows, he looked at her and said softly, "You never talk about why you left Philadelphia." Nora hesitated, then shook her head. "Some stories are better left behind." He didn't press her. Their partnership thrived on that unspoken understanding, that the past didn't define them, that the future was something they were building together, brick by brick. Their first breakthrough came nearly a year into the venture, when a sustainable energy startup accepted their pitch over more established firms. It wasn't a large account, but it opened doors, brought other clients who wanted something different from the corporate machine. Their office expanded, their team grew. Slowly, steadily, their reputation shifted from underdogs to innovators. Nora still returned home to her small apartment each night, the walls crowded with sketches and sticky notes, her kitchen table littered with reports. But the space felt less lonely now, infused with the quiet hum of progress. One evening, after a particularly brutal week, Patrick appeared at her door unannounced, carrying takeout containers and a bottle of cheap wine. "I figured we should celebrate," he said, holding up the food like a peace offering. She let him in without hesitation, the routine familiar by now. They ate cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by paperwork and laughter. "This is ridiculous," she said at one point, gesturing to the scattered files around them. "We're running a business out of a shoebox." Patrick smiled, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, but it's ours." It wasn't until months later, on a winter night softened by falling snow, that everything shifted again. They had stayed late, as usual, revising a proposal for a potential investor. The office was silent except for the sound of typing and the occasional rustle of papers. When they finally packed up, stepping out into the cold, Patrick paused beside her. "You should be home by now," he said quietly. "So should you." He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Nora." She knew what was coming before he said another word. It was in the way he looked at her, not as a colleague or business partner, but as someone who had become essential. When he kissed her, it wasn't dramatic or hurried. It was simple, certain, a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been growing between them for months. They didn't speak about it the next day, nor the day after. But the distance between them had shifted, subtly, irrevocably. Their partnership remained professional on the surface, but beneath it, something deeper took root. A trust, a quiet understanding, a love built not on grand gestures, but on late nights and shared dreams. A year after launching their firm, Patrick proposed. It wasn't extravagant. No ring, no rehearsed speech. They were sitting on her living room floor, reviewing quarterly projections, both of them in sweatpants, surrounded by spreadsheets and empty coffee cups. "Marry me," he said suddenly, looking up from his laptop. "Be my partner in everything." Nora stared at him, her heart pounding. "People will say it's too soon. Let them." She married him 3 months later at City Hall with only Jamie and Patrick's brother as witnesses. There were no elaborate vows, no grand reception, just two people who had chosen each other, not for appearances or expectations, but because they had built something together worth fighting for. Their reception was dinner at their favorite Vietnamese restaurant. The owner insisted on decorating their table with flowers and serving champagne she had saved for special occasions. To partnerships that lift us higher, Patrick toasted, raising his glass. Nora smiled, her fingers threading through his. For the first time in her life, she wasn't proving herself to anyone. She was exactly where she belonged. The years passed quickly, but not without cost. For Nora, the weight of building something real, something lasting, was both exhausting and exhilarating. She and Patrick poured themselves into their company, learning with every misstep, growing with every success. The name Reynolds Capital Partners became known not just in New York, but beyond, synonymous with integrity and innovation, a boutique firm that cared about more than just profits. Their days remained long, their nights often sleepless, but they had built a life together that neither of them had dared imagine back when they sat cross-legged on Nora's apartment floor, eating takeout and dreaming aloud. Their business grew steadily, as did their love, and though the demands of their company consumed most of their time, the foundation they had built remained unshakable. They became known not only as business partners, but as a couple who worked in perfect rhythm, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses like a finely tuned instrument. Patrick's bold ideas matched Nora's meticulous execution. His charisma complemented her quiet, unwavering presence. Their personal life settled into comfortable patterns. They bought a modest but beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, one that felt miles away from the chaos of their office downtown. Their Sundays were spent in the kitchen, trying new recipes, or on the porch reading the newspaper over coffee. They took weekend trips when they could, brief escapes that allowed them to breathe, to remember why they had started all this in the first place. It was not a life of ease, but one of meaning, and for the first time in years, Nora felt at peace. She rarely thought of Philadelphia. When she did, it was like recalling a dream she had long since woken from, a place that had shaped her but no longer defined her. Jamie visited occasionally, bringing updates about mutual acquaintances, though she never mentioned Vivian, Leah, or Oliver. It was an unspoken agreement between them, a boundary neither of them crossed. Until the day everything shifted again. It began with a headline. Patrick slid the financial magazine across the breakfast table one Tuesday morning, his expression unreadable. Nora glanced up from her coffee, frowning at the tightness in his jaw. "You might want to see this," he said quietly. Her gaze dropped to the small headline in the corner, half hidden beneath larger, bolder print. Davis and Associates faces bankruptcy after failed expansion. Nora stared at the words, her pulse quickening despite herself. It took a moment for her to register the name, to process the implication. Davis and Associates. Leah's law firm. She lifted the magazine, scanning the article. It detailed the collapse of the firm's ambitious national expansion, a series of poor investments and high-profile client losses that had left them drowning in debt. The article mentioned Leah by name, describing her as once a rising star in corporate law, now facing the consequences of unchecked ambition. Beneath the text, a small photo accompanied the story. Leah, in a tailored suit, standing stiffly beside a man she recognized instantly. Oliver. "How long have you been following this?" Nora asked, keeping her voice even. Patrick shook his head. "I haven't. But Meridian Investment Group is on our acquisition shortlist. Their sustainable energy portfolio aligns perfectly with ours." He paused, watching her carefully. "And, according to the paperwork, their legal department outsources to Davis and Associates." Nora's stomach tightened. "So, technically, Patrick said, if we acquire Meridian, they'll be part of our corporate structure." She set the magazine down, forcing herself to breathe. "Does it change anything?" he asked after a moment. "Because if it does, we'll walk away. It's not worth it." Nora shook her head slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. "It's just business." But even as she spoke the words, her mind spun with the weight of what this meant. The people who had once dismantled her life, who had torn her heart apart without remorse, were now standing on the brink of ruin. And she, the daughter they had discarded, the sister they had betrayed, stood on the other side of the table, stronger than they had ever imagined. The acquisition moved forward with clinical efficiency. Contracts were reviewed, negotiations conducted, signatures collected. Nora kept her involvement strictly professional, her interactions limited to meetings and legal documentation. She watched as Meridian's assets were absorbed into Reynolds Capital Partners, their employees folded neatly into the growing corporate structure she and Patrick had built from nothing. She learned, through the necessary channels, that Oliver remained in Meridian's compliance department, a mid-level position beneath several layers of management. Leah's name appeared only once in the legal documents, her firm listed as an external contractor pending review. It would have been easy to keep her distance, to let the acquisition proceed without further thought. But something gnawed at her, a restless energy that lingered beneath her calm exterior. One evening, as they reviewed the final merger details, Patrick glanced up from his laptop. "We're hosting a gala to announce the acquisition," he said. "It's customary. Investors, clients, employees, it's good for morale." Nora nodded absently, scrolling through her own notes. "I think we should invite them," he added after a pause. Her eyes flicked up sharply. "Leah and Oliver? And your mother," he said gently. "The legal documents list her as a stakeholder." Nora sat back in her chair, studying him. "You don't have to," he continued, "but maybe it's time." Time for what? She wasn't sure. Closure? Revenge? She had spent years trying to forget them, to carve out a life that had nothing to do with the people who had discarded her like an afterthought. But the truth was, they had shaped her in ways she couldn't ignore. Their betrayal had been the spark that set her life ablaze, forcing her to rebuild from the ashes. Maybe it was time they saw what she had become. She nodded once, closing her laptop. Send them an invitation. The weeks leading up to the gala passed in a blur of preparation. Nora buried herself in the details: venue arrangements, guest lists, menus, speeches. Their events team worked tirelessly, transforming the Natural History Museum into an elegant backdrop for the announcement. Sustainable floral arrangements, a locally sourced menu, carbon-neutral transportation for guests. Every element reflected the values she and Patrick had built their company upon. The invitations were mailed 3 weeks before the event, printed on recycled paper with understated elegance. For Leah, Oliver, and Vivian, Nora included personal notes, brief but pointed. "Looking forward to showing you the life I've built." As the RSVPs trickled in, she scanned each one with clinical detachment. Investors, clients, employees, all expected. Then, one by one, the responses from Philadelphia arrived. Leah and Oliver would attend. Her mother, too. Nora folded the cards neatly and set them aside, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. But when she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it pressed against her chest. Patrick noticed, of course, he always did. "You're not doing this for them," he said quietly one night, sliding into bed beside her. "You're doing this for you." She didn't answer, but she reached for his hand beneath the covers, holding it tightly until sleep finally came. The night of the gala arrived crisp and clear, the autumn air sharp with the promise of winter. The museum shimmered beneath the soft glow of sustainable lighting, the grand hall transformed into a celebration of everything she and Patrick had built. Nora stood near the entrance, greeting guests with practiced ease. Her emerald gown clung to her frame like armor, her hair pinned in an elegant twist, her diamond pendant catching the light. She moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, her smile poised, her posture unshakable. She spotted them the moment they entered. Her mother, in a navy dress that screamed old money and desperation. Leah, standing stiffly beside Oliver, her face carefully composed. They paused just inside the doorway, their eyes scanning the crowd, searching for something familiar. Nora made no move to approach them. "Let them find me," she thought. "Let them see me now." And when they did, when her eyes finally landed on her across the crowded room, she smiled, not for them, for herself. The weight of the night pressed against Nora's skin long before her mother and sister arrived. In the days leading up to the gala, she had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, mapping out every possible interaction, every word she might say or refuse to say. Yet, as the evening unfolded around her in elegant precision, she realized that the script she had prepared was already unraveling. The grand hall of the museum shimmered under soft, sustainable lighting. Tables were dressed in crisp linens, centerpieces composed of seasonal blooms from local farms, their fragrance delicate and unobtrusive. Guests moved like dancers across the marble floor, their conversations a low hum beneath the soft strains of the jazz quartet tucked in the corner. Everywhere Nora looked, she saw the shape of her and Patrick's work, details that reflected not just their success, but the values they had fought to protect. Patrick moved easily among the guests, his smile genuine, his posture relaxed in a way only she would recognize as practiced. He met investors with a firm handshake, employees with a nod of quiet gratitude. His eyes flicked to her often, checking, steadying, reminding her without words that she wasn't facing this night alone. And yet, when she finally turned and met the gaze of her mother across the room, she felt utterly solitary. Vivian Davis stood near the entrance, her expression neutral, carefully arranged. The navy dress she wore clung impeccably to her slender frame, her silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon. She held a champagne flute with the same practiced ease with which she had once corrected Nora's posture at dinner tables, the same poised grace with which she had orchestrated her daughter's betrayal. Leah stood slightly behind her, her face a carefully composed mask. She wore a simple black gown, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun that mirrored their mother's. There was something brittle in the way she carried herself, a stiffness to her shoulders that Nora recognized instantly, because she had carried it once too. Oliver lingered beside Leah, his gaze flickering across the room, restless and uncomfortable. He had aged, she noted absently. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him, shadows beneath them that spoke of sleepless nights and disappointments. They didn't approach her immediately. Instead, they hovered at the edges of the gathering, their eyes following her as she moved among the guests, as she laughed easily at a colleague's joke, as she stood beside Patrick with a hand resting lightly on his arm. Nora let them watch. She wanted them to see her here, surrounded by the life she had built without them. It wasn't revenge she felt. It wasn't even triumph. It was something quieter, deeper, a calm recognition that the people who had once wielded power over her no longer had the capacity to hurt her. When they finally made their way toward her, the conversation she had rehearsed evaporated like mist beneath the bright, clear light of the room. Her mother reached her first, extending both hands with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nora," Vivian said, leaning in for an air kiss that brushed nothing but empty space. "You look extraordinary." Nora inclined her head, her expression polite. "Mother." Leah's smile was thinner, her eyes unreadable. "The event is beautiful," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You've done well for yourself." Nora met her gaze evenly. "We've done well," she corrected, glancing at Patrick, who had quietly moved to stand beside her. "This is the result of a partnership." Patrick extended a hand to her mother, then to Leah and Oliver. "Welcome. We're glad you could join us tonight." Oliver's handshake was stiff, his posture awkward. He avoided Nora's eyes entirely, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. As they exchanged pleasantries, Nora felt the weight of years pressing against the moment, memories of cold dinners and sharp words, of whispered conversations and closed doors. Yet none of it touched her now. They stood here, not as judges or adversaries, but as guests in a world they had no hand in creating. The evening unfolded with calculated grace. Speeches were delivered, acknowledgments made. Patrick spoke with characteristic warmth and confidence, announcing the acquisition of Meridian Investment Group, welcoming their employees and stakeholders into the Reynolds Capital family. Applause followed, polite and enthusiastic. Nora's gaze flicked briefly to her mother and sister during the speech. Vivian's smile remained frozen in place, her eyes calculating. Leah's expression flickered, something tight, almost resentful, crossing her features before she smoothed it away. Oliver's face was unreadable, his jaw tight. As the evening wore on, the initial stiffness of their interaction gave way to something more brittle, more personal. Nora found herself cornered near the dessert table, her mother approaching with a champagne flute in hand, her smile brittle. "I always knew you'd do well for yourself," Vivian said, her tone light but sharp beneath the surface. "You had such potential, even as a child." Nora glanced at her, arching a brow. "Did I? I seem to recall different assessments." Vivian waved a hand dismissively. A mother pushes her children to achieve their best. Sometimes that requires tough love. Nora's smile didn't reach her eyes. Or indifference. Her mother's gaze flickered briefly, then sharpened. "Leah and Oliver are having difficulties," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "Perhaps you could put in a good word. Family should help family." There it was. The real reason behind her mother's attendance. Not reconciliation, not regret. A request thinly disguised as concern. Nora set her glass down carefully. "Their performance will determine their future with the company," she said evenly, "just as mine did." Before Vivian could reply, Leah approached, her posture rigid. "Your husband is impressive," Leah said without preamble. "The way he commands a room. You've done well." The compliment hung in the air, brittle and insincere. "We've done well together," Nora replied quietly. "That's how real partnerships work." Leah's mouth tightened, her gaze flickering away. Oliver remained silent, lingering behind them, his shoulders tense. He hadn't spoken a word to her all evening, and when Nora finally met his gaze, he looked away, unable to hold it. She didn't pursue the conversation further. Instead, she offered them a polite smile, excused herself, and returned to the crowd. Hours later, after the last guest had departed, after the lights had dimmed and the music faded, Nora and Patrick stood together beneath the towering skeleton of the museum's centerpiece exhibit. Patrick glanced at her, his expression soft. "How do you feel?" Nora let out a slow breath, the tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding finally loosening from her shoulders. "Lighter," she said quietly, "like I've put something down I didn't know I was still carrying." He nodded, slipping his hand into hers. "They seemed smaller," he said after a moment. Nora smiled faintly. "They are smaller, or maybe I'm just bigger." She knew in that moment that whatever came next, whatever conversations or confrontations awaited, she had already won. Not because she had risen higher, not because she had proven them wrong, but because she no longer needed their approval. Because she had built a life they could not touch. And she had done it on her own terms. The city stretched out beneath the early morning sky, still wrapped in the hush of the hours before dawn. The Grand Museum, which only hours ago had pulsed with the hum of music, conversation, and clinking glasses, now stood silent, its marble floors echoing with the soft footsteps of the cleaning staff. Outside, the streets were empty, slick with the promise of an autumn rain that had yet to fall. Within the quiet confines of their home, Nora sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling between her hands, the weight of the evening settling around her shoulders like a well-worn coat. She had not slept. Patrick appeared in the doorway, his tie undone, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows. His presence filled the room gently, the way it always had, grounding her without fanfare or force. "You're up early," he said quietly. Nora glanced up, offering him a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep." He crossed the room, leaning against the counter, watching her carefully. There was no judgment in his gaze, no questions that pressed too hard, only understanding, soft and steady. "I thought maybe, now that it's done," he began, but she shook her head before he could finish. "It's not done," she said softly. "Not yet." Patrick said nothing, only moved to sit across from her, his hands folding over hers across the table's worn surface. Hours later, when the city had fully awakened, when emails began to arrive and the remnants of the night before faded into memory, Nora stood in front of her closet, staring at the rows of carefully curated dresses and suits, the neat lines of shoes and handbags that spoke of a life meticulously built. She chose a simple outfit, a soft sweater, dark jeans, no jewelry but her wedding band. She pinned her hair back without effort, without care for how it might look. Patrick stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, a quiet question in his eyes. "I need to see them," she said before he could ask. He nodded once, then stepped aside. The cafe was quiet when she arrived, tucked on a corner far from the polished heart of the financial district. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, with scuffed wooden floors and mismatched chairs, the smell of coffee and something sweet lingering in the air. She slid into a booth by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup she barely touched. Vivian arrived first. Her mother's posture was as poised as ever, her navy coat pristine, her hair perfectly styled. But there was a tightness around her mouth, a shadow in her eyes that Nora recognized instantly. The same shadow she had seen in the mirror years ago. "Nora," Vivian greeted her, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. "Mother." They sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of dishes and low murmur of conversation filling the space between them. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Vivian said finally. Nora's smile was faint, without warmth. "You always did underestimate me." Vivian's lips thinned. "I came last night because I thought perhaps we could put the past behind us." Nora met her gaze evenly. "And now?" Her mother's gaze flickered away. "Leah and Oliver are struggling." Nora's breath caught, not with surprise but with recognition. She had expected this. "They built their life on a lie," she said quietly. "It was bound to collapse." Vivian's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and wounded all at once. "You think I didn't want the best for you? I think you wanted the best version of me that fit into your world," Nora replied, her voice steady. "And when I couldn't be that, you pushed me aside." Vivian inhaled sharply, as if the words struck her physically, but she did not deny them. Nora leaned back in her seat, her gaze softening. "You don't have to apologize," she said after a moment. "Not for me. I stopped needing your approval a long time ago." Her mother's expression crumbled just for a moment before she gathered herself again. "You've done well for yourself." "I've done well, despite you," Nora corrected gently. They sat in silence again, the unspoken weight of everything between them settling like dust. When Vivian finally stood to leave, she hesitated, her hand resting on the edge of the table. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted quietly. Nora shook her head. "You don't have to." She watched her mother walk away, her shoulders straighter than they had been when she arrived, though the years had carved something fragile into the line of her spine. Leah and Oliver were waiting when Nora arrived at the office later that afternoon, seated stiffly in the glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city skyline. They both rose when she entered, though neither met her gaze immediately. Oliver looked older than she remembered, his suit impeccable, but his face drawn, the shadows beneath his eyes deeper than they had been the night before. Leah stood beside him, her posture brittle, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for seeing us," Leah said quietly. Nora closed the door behind her, crossing the room to stand at the head of the table. "I didn't call this meeting," she said evenly. "You did." Leah nodded, her gaze dropping briefly to the folder in her hands. "Our firm is at risk," she said, her voice clipped, professional. "We've lost key clients. We're restructuring." Nora said nothing, waiting. Leah hesitated, then glanced at Oliver, who finally spoke. "We're here because we know the decision about whether Davis and Associates remains in partnership with Meridian is yours." Nora met his gaze steadily, holding it until he looked away. "You're asking me to save you," she said quietly. Leah's jaw tightened. "We're asking for a chance." Nora considered them for a long moment, the silence stretching. "I spent years," she said finally, her voice low, "trying to understand why you did what you did, why you thought I wasn't enough." Leah flinched just slightly. "I don't need an explanation anymore," Nora continued. "I don't need closure, but I will not carry the weight of your choices." She glanced down at the folder on the table, then back at them. "I will review your proposal," she said simply. "If it aligns with our values, with the standards we uphold, we'll consider maintaining the partnership. If it doesn't, we won't." Leah's mouth opened as if to argue, but Nora lifted a hand, stopping her. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's just business." She watched them leave the conference room, their shoulders heavy, their footsteps slow. When they were gone, she returned to her office, closing the door softly behind her. Patrick was waiting, leaning against the edge of her desk. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. Nora exhaled, a slow, steady breath. "I let them go," she said. He crossed the room, pulling her into his arms, his chin resting against the crown of her head. "You already had," he murmured. That night, as they sat on the porch of their home, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Nora let herself feel the fullness of everything she had carried, the weight of expectation, the ache of betrayal, the long, winding road that had brought her here. And then she let it go. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved freedom. Patrick reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining easily, naturally. "To everything we've built," he said quietly. Nora smiled, her gaze lifting to the stars above. "To everything still to come," she replied. And in that moment, she knew she had finally, completely let them go. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel for more stories like this. And if this video resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it too.